Well, we left off with the Holiness Movement. That's where we're going to pick up. You remember the Holiness Movement created the Methodist Church. It was this John Wesley created Methodist societies or Methodist clubs where people would get together and they'd pray together and study Scripture together and outline fasting together and tithing and so forth and keep each other accountable and just try to keep each other, as close to Christ as possible. And Wesley did not want that, to produce a church. He wanted it just to produce a reformation within the church, but it ended up breaking off anyway. Wesley believed, and this is one of the few areas I disagree with Wesley, but Wesley believed it was possible for a believer to eventually become completely sinless. He believed that it was possible to be so sanctified that you would have absolutely no sin in your life. He backed, a little later in life, he backed off that a bit, probably when he got older and was still sinning and realized, well, if I can't do it, maybe no one else can either. So many in the Holiness Movement began to embrace what's called a second work of grace that would eliminate all sin from the life of a believer. And these groups began to split off from the Methodist Church as the Methodist Church began to kind of say, well, it's not going to eliminate all sin, but that includes the Church of God, the Nazarene Church, the Church of Christ, and Christian Union. These are all offshoots from the Methodist Church. There's also the Wesleyan Church. That was actually an offshoot from the Methodist Church. They actually split over slavery during the Civil War. Now, all these churches actually were initially regional splits from the Methodist Church. Okay, long ago, before the days of, not only just before the days of internet, before the days of telephones. I mean, word got around pretty slow. And so if you decided to split from the Methodist Church, it was typically, or any church, it was typically a regional split. And what would happen was by the time word reached like the West Coast, that some people in Florida had become upset with the mainline denomination and created this whole new thing. They'd already created their own denomination there in Florida. The guys in California created their own denomination in California. They basically believe the same things, but you got different people calling the shots, and they don't want that person to call the shots here, and so forth, and so that's what you get. So the church, with a few exceptions, there are some exceptions. There's some doctrinal differences, but they're minor. The Church of God, the Nazarene Church, the Church of Christ and Christian Union, really 95% of what they believe is the same thing. They're really governed the same way in many ways. The only difference is they broke off from the Methodist Church in different regions, and they just went their own ways, and they have their own structure and so forth. But if you're a Nazarene, you walk into a Church of Christ and Christian Union, you're going to feel perfect. You're going to feel like you're at home, and vice versa. But then we come into, here's where I'm going to upset some of you, speaking in tongues. From at least the 2nd century, we're talking about around the time of the death of the earliest apostles. The Apostle John probably dies latest, probably sometime in the 70s, 80s. And from the time his students, like Ignatius and Antioch, so forth, they start to die, up until the 20th century, anybody who really pushed speaking in tongues were actually condemned as heretics by the church. And most of them were heretical groups. They believed some things that were just unbiblical. And so tongue speaking did not have a very good reputation because it was so associated with groups that often were heretical. And in fact, many scholars still argue. In fact, there are some Bible verses that are different, but in a lot of time when you see speaking in tongues in the New Testament, it's not some kind of secret God language. It's speaking in a foreign language. So when the apostles speak at Pentecost, when they're speaking, the people are amazed that they're speaking in their tongue. So you have all these people from all over the world coming to Jerusalem for Passover, and the apostles start to speak in tongues. I mean, suddenly they're speaking like Latin and so forth. And the apostles didn't know that, so it is a miracle. It is inspired by the Holy Spirit, but it's not, some kind of secret God talk. And that's often what speaking in tongues means. In other places, you see the Apostle Paul saying, it gets out of hand too quickly. And the Apostle Paul says, tamper it down. The Apostle Paul says, I would rather have, solid teaching and preaching everyone can understand rather than, that kind of stuff. And it's always supposed to be orderly. Well, it hasn't always been that way. So speaking in tongues actually was very rarely practiced in the church. That all changed in 1901 in Topeka, Kansas, when Agnes Osmond, there's Agnes, a poor picture of her, but there's not 1901. They didn't exactly have, Well, still the iPhone still kind of stinks, the camera on your iPhone, but they didn't even have that in 1901. And so that's Agnes, and she began speaking in tongues and claimed to have been baptized in the Spirit. And after having been baptized in the Spirit, the way you knew you were baptized in the Spirit was you spoke in tongues. She did this, and she finally convinced her preacher to follow suit, a guy by the name of Charles Parham. Charles Parham is a major figure simply for who he influenced, which is this fella, William Seymour. William Seymour is an African-American preacher from Houston, Texas, who studied under Parham and went out to do a revival in Los Angeles in 1906. He ended up preaching, he started preaching in churches and got kicked out of a lot of the churches. So a lot of the churches basically said he was preaching heresy, this baptism in the Spirit stuff. They said, get out. And so he ended up renting out a really ramshackle warehouse in Azusa Street in Los Angeles, and began to preach there. And he would preach on the necessity of being baptized in the Spirit, and that the only way you know you've been baptized in the Spirit is to speak in tongues. Now, this is a pretty new teaching in the church. So these revival services took place sometimes well into the night. As many as 1,500 people jammed into this ramshack. I mean, it was nasty. I mean, the Los Angeles Times, you go back and read like the articles on it, and reporters from the Los Angeles Times would go down there and be like, they were like afraid that the ceiling was going to collapse. You know, this was not a nice place, but there were 1,500 people packed. It was really hot. They claimed to have been healed of diseases. There were people, but even they used to have religious reporters for newspapers, believe it or not, who covered church services. Actually, in the New York Times used to print sermons from some of the larger churches in New York City, believe it or not. They print the text, the sermons on Mondays from Sunday. But the religious reporter for the Los Angeles Times, he was just absolutely disgusted. He said it was weird. He said it was just kind of getting out of hand. People barking like dogs, people just writhing on the floor, that kind of stuff. But that's really what kicked it off. And Azusa, so you still have the Azusa Street in 1906 creates what's called the Pentecostal Movement. That's where it comes from. And that revival went on for years. Got a lot of publicity, especially because Seymour prophesied that God's wrath was coming. And it just so happened that the day it was printed in the newspaper that he was saying that God's wrath was coming, San Francisco got hit with this major earthquake. And so Seymour could say, see? Right? And so that gave him some street cred, and more people began to come hear him. So the revival gave birth to the Pentecostal movement and denominations like the Assemblies of God. Right? The Assemblies of God is the largest Pentecostal denomination in the world. Calvary Chapel, I'm going to argue here in a minute, is pretty impressive. They don't have as many churches, but I'm going to run some stats by on Calvary Chapel that are really, really impressive. Well, what do Pentecostals believe? Pentecostals believe you must be baptized in the Holy Spirit in order to know you got to have the Spirit, so you got to be baptized in the Spirit. You evidence that by you speak in tongues. And there are three great works of grace. There's salvation, sanctification, and empowerment. Those are three steps. You get saved, you get sanctified, and then you're empowered with gifts of the Spirit. That's typical Pentecostal belief. The Assemblies of God were born out of a conference, actually, in 1914 in Hot Springs, Arkansas. Many adherents to Pentecostalism found they were not welcome in their churches. The people who went to like the Azusa Street revival and people who went off and started preaching, who had attended that revival, they went back to their home churches and started talking about being baptized in the Spirit, speaking in tongues, and the church was like, no, go away. So they formed their own denomination, Assemblies of God. And it started off as just a few hundred people, and they really, their real problem was, they had all these people, all these preachers they were training that were, teaching baptism in the Spirit, speaking in tongues and gifts of the Spirit, but they couldn't get money for missionaries, they couldn't get credentials as ministers, so they decided to form their own denomination. So that meeting of 300 people in Arkansas has, over the last 100 years, given birth to more than 12,000 congregations, 3 million members in the U.S., 50 million worldwide. Assemblies of God boast more than 50 million members worldwide. Pentecostalism is the fastest growing religious movement in Africa and in South America, spreading like wildfire. Now there's in a second there's an offshoot of that that's also spreading like wildfire in Africa that needs to be put out, but I'll talk about that in a second. So the Assemblies believe in the baptism of the Holy Spirit as evidenced by this speaking in tongues and that divine healing. That's also, the Assemblies also push divine healing. That divine healing is part of Jesus' atoning work on the cross, that it's possible to come to healing, and some take it to the extreme. Some members of the Assemblies of God, just like Christian Scientists, will not go to doctors because they believe that, that's just, God will heal me if it's God's will. Let me just say, I'm not big on, I'm not a guy that's into speaking in tongues and so forth. I don't condemn it. Yes, it's in the Bible, so be it. But the Bible is very clear. One, it's always supposed to be orderly. It cannot get out of control, and often it does. Two, it's never supposed to be about the person. If you do not have an interpreter, you're not speaking in tongues, you're just looking for attention. And Paul clearly condemns that in the New Testament. That is never to happen. But this divine healing thing, here's where I really part company with the Assemblies of God, who generally are good people. I went to seminary. My best friend in seminary was an Assemblies of God dude. Great guy, John Romanowski. And this divine healing thing, now he didn't buy into that. He himself was hard of hearing. He was born hard of hearing, and he was saving up money for cochlear implants. And he said that was going to hurt him. He knew that was going to hurt him as Assemblies of God minister, that people would see the implants go, oh, you just don't trust God's healing. And his response was, I trust God to work through a doctor just as I trust him to work through prayer, and so do I. This is where I really part company. Now, like I said, not every assembly is like, if you're a member of the Assemblies of God and you go to the hospital, the minister's going to come visit you. He's not going to condemn you. He's not going to, they don't pound it. It's not something they're going to smack you up the head with, though some do take it to an extreme. Right? And I certainly believe God can heal, but, I always tell people all the time, if somebody comes to me and, doctors, what do they know? I go, that guy's going to be dead in 6 months. That's just the way that works. What do doctors know? About 8 years of medical school more than you. That's what they know. With the Assemblies of God, the churches are autonomous. So that means the individual congregation calls its own shots. Okay, so each congregation hires and fires its own preachers, stuff they don't, so it handles its own money. They do have regional fellowships and a national council where they elect representatives from each to coordinate missions, humanitarian relief, etc. But these fellows, they're really they're loosey-goosey, and so it's not, they don't push really hard. But the assemblies, it's interesting, they've been really strong. I'll give them credit. Most of the assemblies have been really strong in the face of a lot of cultural pressure that churches are facing these days when it comes to, bathrooms and all the other kind of, stuff, which I actually got a couple nasty messages about my joke the other day I put on Facebook, and I was watching the NFL draft, and I said, I'm disappointed that I'm probably going to go undrafted again, even though I self-identify as a 21-year-old, 6'5" wide receiver with great hands. And some people didn't think that was funny. Anyway, out of that Pentecostal movement, though, there have been other denominations, obviously. For example, the Church of the Foursquare Gospel. I always thought that was a mouthful, but the Foursquare Gospel means Jesus is Savior, Sender of the Holy Spirit, Healer, and Future King. That's the four squares that they put on that. That's why there is. And there are others. There are many others. There's the Apostolic Movement. The Apostolic Movement is a wing of Pentecostalism that really stresses more signs and gifts than do Assemblies of God. So they stress more of the gifts of the Spirit than prophecy and so forth. So that'd be the Apostolic Church. But you also have churches like there are some Pentecostal churches where even if you're a guy like me that just gets kind of, just not comfortable around some of that, the flag waving and the speaking in tongues and stuff like that. It's just that, not my thing, like Calvary Chapel. Calvary Chapel is actually an offshoot of the Pentecostal movement. It was actually an offshoot of the Church of the Foursquare Gospel. And Calvary Chapel, I'm a real fan of Calvary Chapel, and I always have been. Calvary Chapel was founded by the late pastor Chuck Smith in 1965 in Costa Mesa, California. And it was basically what I call Pentecostal light. Chuck Smith believes in speaking in tongues, he believes in divine healing, but he really pushes, and he pushes from the pulpit. Anybody does it without an interpreter, anybody disrupts the service, you're out. And he was hardcore about that, and so it didn't get out of hand that way, and which is the way, according to Paul, that's the way it's supposed to be, right? But Chuck Smith was a great guy because 1965, if you think about what was going on in California, he was planning a church south of Los Angeles, and so he was starting this church, and this young guy who he baptized and brought to faith came to him and said, I know of all kinds of people who don't know Jesus Christ. They're young, they're disenfranchised. It's kind of the early hippie movement. And so he brought him down to the beach, in California, down to Venice Beach. And he said, look at all these people. They need Jesus. And Chuck Smith admitted, he said, my first thought was, what they need is a haircut, a shower, and a job. But those are the people he ended up evangelizing. And really the Jesus People movement of the late 60s, early 70s was started by Chuck Smith. Calvary Chapel took off evangelizing young people, and he was the first church to incorporate Christian rock into the worship service. He was the first one to make sure that no one on staff was dressed in suits and so forth because he wanted everyone to feel welcome. So people come in their flip-flops, and all because they'd come right off the beach, that kind of thing. He welcomed them in. And that church grew to about 12,000 people doing that. And this was the amazing thing. If you look at the average church today, the average, what's called evangelical church, which I'll talk about here in a minute, especially large kind of seeker-sensitive church, typically about 80 to 90% of the members of that church are from other churches, left other churches to go there. Only about 10% of the people at those seeker-sensitive churches found Jesus Christ at that church, came to faith at that church. At Calvary Chapel, the exact opposite. 90% of those 12,000 found Jesus Christ at that church. Folks, that's an impressive number. That's why I'm a fan of Calvary Chapel. Now, Calvary Chapel has what's called affiliations. They don't really have a denomination. It's just one of those things where you have to go through a certain level of ordination, and then you can go plant a church with the title Calvary Chapel if you choose. And there are some big ones. There's a really big one in Philadelphia, where about 5,000-6,000 people there. There's the one in Costa Mesa is still doing really well, though Chuck Smith died a few years ago. And Chuck Smith is he's one of those guys that you don't mess around with. He's a really sweet guy. He was a sweet guy. But he basically set up Calvary Chapel so that, the worship was always to be modern. It was always to be evangelistically focused. It was never to be inwardly focused. And you had to preach what's called expository preaching. That means verse by verse, book by book. So you can still go online. If you want good Bible teaching, you can go online, find Calvary Chapel, and find Chuck Smith's teachings, the late Chuck Smith's teachings, and you can listen to him preach and teach from Genesis through Revelation, verse by verse. And that's how he did it. And it's good stuff. I didn't always agree with him, but he was a godly man. All right. All that being said, I'm not Pentecostal, but I don't mind Pentecostals. God bless them and keep them. Though often it can just get out of hand. And of course it can get to that I do not like you're not a Christian unless. And there are some of them out there. There are churches in this county that if you haven't spoken in tongues, you're not a Christian. That's not biblical. Now, so God bless the Pentecostals, but one of the more unfortunate offshoots, it kind of hooked into that divine healing thing, and it kind of grew from there and is now known as the health and wealth gospel, the prosperity gospel. Joel Osteen, yeah, he's one of them. Creflo Dollar bills, y'all. Those kind of folks. Now, early Pentecostal preachers were hardcore on the gospel, very evangelistic. They did not embrace prosperity theology. Prosperity theology did not infiltrate the Pentecostal movement until the late 40s and early 50s, but that's where it eventually found its home. Remember Oral Roberts? He was one of the early ones, yeah. Talk about him in a second. Now, to be fair, many Pentecostal preachers were poorly trained because it took a long time for them to get Bible college, their own Bible college and seminary set up. And so they were poorly trained, and so they some of them probably unintentionally, some intentionally kind of butchered verses like Malachi 3:10, John 10:10, and 3 John 1. Now, if you'll look up, for example, and Malachi 3:10 is one of their absolute favorite. I'll look it up here real quick. I meant to have it up, and then I got interrupted and I lost my place. I'm getting old. I can't multitask anymore. I can barely unitask anymore. Malachi 3:10, bring the full tithe into the storehouse, and there may be food in my house, and thereby put me to the test, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open the windows of heaven for you and pour down for you a blessing until there is no more need. Now they look at that and say, see, if you give 10%, God will give you 20%. Just trust and faith, and the storehouses of heaven will be open. He'll rain down blessings. But if you notice, what it says is, I will meet your need, not your want. See the problem with that? God says, yeah, if you trust me, I will take care of your needs. I'll make sure you're fed and clothed and you got a warm place to sleep. He said, but not guarantee you a Mercedes-Benz and that ain't what he's talking about. Yeah. Where does this all come from? Actually, the prosperity gospel, we think, was pretty much fathered by this guy, E.W. Kenyon, who was exposed to something called the New Thought movement, which taught positive thought could overcome illness and bring success. You still see this in the New Age movement, right? Just send that. That was that book, The Gift or The Secret, right? It was, you just send out positive vibes and positive things will come back to you, right? Okay, try driving through New Boston with that. See how that works for you. So in 1947, Oral Roberts began to teach that the more a person gave in faith, the more God would bless them. Right? I always wondered why it was then that Oral Roberts wasn't just giving more himself, because remember when he went on TV in the late 80s and said he needed $1 million quickly or God was going to kill him? Yes. God can't raise $1 million without killing Oral Roberts? I mean,
That dog track under giving that $1 million.
Yeah?
And Oral taught all of his dogs to heal.
That's funny. Oh, boy. The health and wealth movement really took off with the advent of televangelism, right? Televangelism has not always been around. It really took off in the late 60s and early 70s when satellite, became a possible. When you found out you could buy a satellite. I mean, this is how ESPN took off, too. A guy, wanted to do, ESPN took off because a businessman in Connecticut wanted to broadcast local sports. And so he bought a satellite. And they said, he's like, well, how far can we broadcast? He said, can we go 20 miles? He goes, sir, you can go around the world. They're like, what? He had no idea that you could do that. And so he said, well, okay, so we just started, and so he created ESPN. And ESPN, if you go back and look at the early days of ESPN, I mean, they were covering NCAA Division III wrestling finals. I mean, that's what you got in the early days of ESPN. You got Foxy boxing or roller derby, and you got stuff like that because they didn't have the money to do Major League Baseball and stuff back then. But the health and wealth stuff took off quick because they didn't have to rely on advertisers. They had people sending them money. right? And so you had guys like Jim Baker and Robert Tilton and Benny Hinn and Kenneth Hagin and later even non-charismatics. Joel Osteen is not a Pentecostal, not a member of the Pentecostal movement, but he latched onto that thing, right? The health and wealth part. Jim Baker, by the way, has repented of all this. You know, Jim Baker went through that huge scandal, you know, ended up going to jail for tax evasion, all that kind of stuff, and he came out of it. He wrote a book. It's a really good book, and the book is titled, I Was Wrong. And if you read the book, he admits that when he was preaching, he was doing his televangelism thing, doing his health and wealth thing, he said he never read through the Bible all the way through once in his life as a minister. He said, I just went and looked for the verses that supported what I wanted to preach. And that's what they do. That's what they do.
Is Robert Schuller included in that?
Robert Schuller would probably not be included in the health and wealth part, but he certainly was a power or positive thinking guy. Yeah. The Assemblies of God, to their credit, have officially criticized the health and wealth movement as heretical, as has most scholars, everybody from John MacArthur and John Piper, Rick Warren, on and on and on. Most Christian leaders have condemned health and wealth gospel as completely heretical. And it is. I mean, it's unbiblical. You know, I sit there, and he may be a nice guy. I don't know, but, you know, I'm not trying to get personal. He may be a wonderful person. But, you know, I watched Joel Osteen get up there and put his Bible over his head and said, you know, basically I pledge allegiance to this, and then go on and speak for the next 30 minutes and never mention a verse in context ever. And he ordered that there be no crosses in his church because it's too depressing. He says he never uses the word sin because that's depressing. And he says people are too beat up during the week and they need to be lifted up, so we don't need to talk about stuff like that. I think the Apostle Paul might disagree. All right, just a bit. John Wesley, who we talked about last week, certainly would disagree. I told you, John Wesley, you know, he said that, you know, his method of preaching was, I preach hellfire and damnation, 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 grace, hellfire and damnation, hellfire and damnation, hellfire, grace, and that's, you know, that's how he did things. All right, any questions over that? Questions or comments over that before we move on to talk about what is probably the most significant split over the last 100 years, which is the liberal-conservative split of the early 20th century. All righty, here we go. This is the most significant split. I mean, the terms that we have today, so many of our denominations, so many of our schools are all identified with either belonging to one side of this split. All right? So you've got, on one side, you've got Wheaton College, and you've got Cedarville, and you've got Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and you've got Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and you've got Biola, and you've got over here. And over here you've got Princeton and Yale Divinity School and Harvard Divinity School and so forth. I mean, Harvard Divinity School has transgenders on the faculty teaching in the Divinity School. Oh, how did this all come about? Well, in the 18th and 19th century, academics began to seek truth outside the church. In response to the Protestant Reformation and all the fighting over that and the fighting between Catholics and Protestants and so forth, a number of academics in Europe began to declare themselves atheists. They said, the church can't get its act together, and we need to seek truth outside the church. And so they did. And then when that began to happen, when that began to infiltrate the universities, especially first in Germany, because at one time, Germany had what was considered the finest universities in the world. So France, England, America all looked to the German universities to see how to do things. And this first hit Germany. And the German academics largely were embarrassed by what they saw in the Bible as enlightened academics, talking snakes, talking donkeys, you know, all this other kind of stuff. And so they began to water it down. They began to label a lot of it as myth. That a lot of the Old Testament is myth. It's not. It's like a fairy tale, told to, you know, it's like Aesop's fable, right? It's got a truth to it, but it's not necessarily rooted in historical fact. And they began to write in with guys like Frederick Strauss and others began to argue that Jesus didn't rise from the dead because people don't rise from the dead, but he rises in our hearts. that kind of stuff. And so that stuff began to hit the German universities, and because France and Great Britain were jealous of the German universities, then of course they began to copy, and because Harvard and Yale and so forth were always jealous of like Oxford and Cambridge, they began to copy them, and it just had a domino effect. By the time you get to the 18th century, Harvard Divinity School is now Unitarian. That means they rejected the Trinity. Now, it's hard to imagine, but it's true. Harvard, Yale, and Princeton were all founded to train ministers to preach the gospel. Yeah. Now, oh goodness sakes, ain't the gospel they're teaching. Well, all this began to come to a head because you've got Princeton, and you've got Yale, and you've got Harvard. Those were the great seminaries where you sent your best and brightest to be trained as ministers. Back when ministers were the best educated people in any city, and it was always a place in a town or city, you would always, if you wanted wisdom or counsel, you went to the minister, because the minister was the guy who was trained in philosophy and in Greek and in Hebrew and in ancient history and so forth, right? So you went to see that guy. But you know, so they began to send their young kids off, and they'd come back saying, oh, there's no Trinity, there's no resurrection, and people were starting going, what? What they teaching you, boy? You know? And so this all came to a head. Two wealthy Presbyterians out in California named Lyman and Milton Stewart, they offered to completely fund an official conservative response to liberalism. They wanted an academic response to the liberals. So they recruited A.C. Dixon and R.A. Torrey, two academics, and they edited a 12-volume set containing 90 essays penned by 64 different conservative scholars. It was published by the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, or Biola, still a college out in California, between 1910 and 1915 as the Fundamentals. This defended the Trinity. This defended the virgin birth. This defended the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This defended the second coming. This defended miracles. This defended those kind of things. Liberals just basically laughed at it, and they said that Christians, and they began to derisively refer to those who subscribed to teachings in those books as fundamentalists. That's where the term comes from. Fundamentalists. One of the most prominent conservative scholars who fought liberalism was Princeton's own J. Gresham Machen. He was a world-class scholar, very well thought of even among liberals, even though he was a conservative. And in 1923, he really threw the gauntlet down with a book called Christianity and Liberalism. He went beyond what the fundamentals defended conservative faith. Machen went on the attack, and in Christianity and Liberalism, still a book in print, and very well worth reading, argued that liberal Christianity was actually a wholly different religion. He said, what you're teaching is not Christianity. He said, I don't know what you call it, but it's not Christianity. He said, if you do not believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ as the Son of God, what you are teaching is not Christianity. And he made a very strong argument about it. However, the liberals won. They won the fight to keep control of the mainline denominations and their schools. Princeton still liberal, Yale still liberal, Harvard still liberal. They're all very liberal. And you know, it's happened to even other schools that get what I call Harvard envy. If a Christian school wants to be respected academically by non-Christian institutions, that Christian school is about a generation away from being a place you don't want to send your kids to. I did my seminary degree at Abilene Christian University. It's headed that way. I could see that when I was there. All the young professors were liberal. All the old professors were conservative. The old professors are retiring. It's going to go liberal. And they have what one of my professors called, said, unfortunately, we have Harvard envy. Yeah, we want to be respected. And it's got to stop. But we got a number of schools. Out of that split, because you had Princeton, Yale, and Harvard, you get new schools. You get Wheaton College. You get Cedarville. You get all these different schools suddenly that pop up. Westminster Theological Seminary, later Fuller Theological Seminary, so forth. All these places start to pop up as places to go train where you could actually hear the gospel and hear Orthodox teaching. Dad wrestled with this too. I mean, Dad went to undergraduate at Kentucky Christian University, but Dad went to seminary at Vanderbilt Divinity School. By the time he got to Vanderbilt in the late 50s, it had gone liberal. And I'm going to introduce you to a scholar here in a minute who Dad will tell you saved his faith. Well, the one problem with the fundamentalist movement, so after 1915, 1923, you've got liberals and you've got fundamentalists, right? Those are the two wings you have. The problem fundamentalists had, and you still see some of this today, is that they were not engaging the culture. They were hiding from the culture. They were actually creating their own subculture, right? So that you had fundamentalists, many fundamentalist churches didn't listen to the radio. They didn't have TVs back during this time, right? But they didn't listen to the radio. That was too worldly. We didn't go to the movies, too worldly, right? Didn't read, non-Christian books, too worldly, right? We didn't get into all that philosophy and science nonsense. That's all of the devil. We don't do any of that. And so a number of conservative, a number of fundamentalist academics began to say, wait a minute. Jesus calls us to be salt and light in the world. And if we have the truth, what are we afraid of? And why are we engaging with scientists and philosophers and so forth? We got nothing to be ashamed of. We got nothing to be afraid of. And the academic that led this movement was this man right here, Dr. Carl F.H. Henry. This is the guy that my father will tell you saved his faith when he was editor of Christianity Today. He was the first editor of Christianity Today, appointed by a guy by the name of Billy Graham. And Carl Henry wrote a book in 1947 called The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism. And what he did was he argued that while he agreed with all the doctrines of fundamentalism, he said, guys, we cannot hide from the world. We've got to engage the world. We've got to engage the world politically, philosophically, scientifically. We've got to engage the world. We've got to quit hiding. He found a number of people around him that were supporting him, another academic named Edward J. Carnell, a little-known pastor at the time named Billy Graham. He was not well-known at the time in 1947. It wasn't well-known until later on, in the late 40s, when he began preaching in Los Angeles. And another pastor academic, a guy who was a pastor of a church in Boston, but also had a PhD in philosophy, Dr. Harold Ockenjay, who founded the National Association of Evangelicals. This gave rise to what was called the Evangelical Movement. Evangelicals are different from fundamentalists, not in what they believe, but how they deal with the world, how they approach issues. Evangelicals agree with fundamentalists on most doctrinal positions, but they believe it is absolutely necessary to fully engage the culture. Whether that be politics, whether that be like Christian apologetics, we have to engage the culture. And evangelicals have founded or been able to maintain control over a number of great institutions. One of my favorites, Southern Evangelical Seminary in Charlotte, and Biola out in Los Angeles, which also has their seminary, the Talbot School of Theology, very, very good seminary. Most of the Southern Baptist schools have been evangelical, though a lot of them are becoming really kind of hardcore Calvinist, and the only problem with that is it's just a lot of them have become, if you're not a Calvinist, you're an idiot kind of thing, and that's divisive, and I don't like that either. So that's what an evangelical is. An evangelical is a fundamentalist who doesn't hide from the world. Spoiler alert, if you attend Christ Community Church, you attend an evangelical church. We are basically fundamentalists who are not afraid of the world. We're not afraid to talk about science. We're not afraid to talk politics. We're not afraid to do that. We believe all truth is God's truth, and we're not afraid of it. Right? But there are some churches that agree with us on almost everything we believe, but basically they say, oh, you just need to have faith. You just need to have faith. You just need to have faith. Don't worry about all that stuff. You just need to have faith. I'm like, why would Paul take 16 chapters to write the book of Romans if all he had to say was, just have faith? That's a short letter right there. Yeah. And that also, of course, misunderstands what the word faith is. The Greek word pisteuo, which we translate as faith, does not mean just believe. That is not what the Greek word means. It means believe in, trust in, loyalty to. It is a wide range of meanings in pisteuo. And so it's just not that, just that kind of thing. It's people have real questions, they deserve real answers. As best we can give them, And we have pretty darn good answers. One of my favorite is, as many of you know, one of my favorite people to listen to is Dr. William Lane Craig. Now, he often speaks, and even though I've been studying apologetics for years, sometimes I even have to go look up in the dictionary what in the world he's talking about. He's got 2 masters, 2 doctorates, speaks a dozen languages, and he's a Christian apologist out of Atlanta. And he debates atheists. He debates leading atheist academics, at least 1 or 2 a year. And he's been doing it for more than 30 years. He has never lost a debate.
What's his name again?
William Lane Craig.
Craig.
He has never lost a debate. There's always a panel of judges. There's usually a Christian atheist and an agnostic or somebody like that. And he has won every single debate he has ever engaged in. Taking on Christian scientists, taking on anti-Christian scientists, anti-Christian physicists, philosophers, you name it. And he's whooped up on them all. We have good answers. It just takes a little studying. Is there any good news? While most mainline liberal denominations are dying, when you hear all this stuff on the media, the church is dying in America, the church is dying in America, the church is dying, what they're talking about are the mainline liberal churches. They're dying. That is true. The Disciples of Christ, the Presbyterian Church, USA, the Northern Baptist Church, the Episcopal Church, Anglican Church, those churches are dying. The Evangelical Lutheran Church, which I told you last week is weird because it's not evangelical, but they use the term. It's actually the liberal version of the Lutheran Church. Go figure. Those denominations are dying, and they're dying quickly. Evangelical churches are growing. They are still growing. The only denomination, they don't consider themselves a denomination, that is really growing actually are independent Christian churches. They're growing, but they're basically evangelical churches. Evangelical churches are growing. Unfortunately, the only other church that is growing or movement is the health and wealth gospel. The 2 fastest growing churches in South America and in China and in Africa are evangelical Pentecostals and health and wealth. Health and wealth gospel, the prosperity gospel. And that second one needs to be stopped because that nonsense is just absolutely ridiculous. But there is hope, and here's where the hope comes from. Because evangelical churches like Christ Community Church do not belong to a denomination, most evangelical churches are actually willing to work across party lines. The more non-denominational evangelical churches there are, and that's what's growing, the fewer bishops and supervisors you've got running things, the more churches can work together. You actually find a great deal of unity on a Christian campus. I went to seminary, even though I went to a Church of Christ seminary, it was only 50% Church of Christ. The other 50% of the people I went to seminary with were Southern Baptists, Presbyterians, Assemblies of God, so forth. One Catholic. And we got along great. And so there is actually a possibility of unity if we're not so stupid as to say, great, we're unified. Who's going to be the bishop? The moment you start to build a hierarchy beyond the church, within 100 years, you're either going to be liberal and dying, or you're going to have split 3 times. Have you seen that pattern? You know, I have my differences with the Church of Christ, but they get one thing right, and that is, the New Testament basically says that the elder/pastor should run the church there at the local level, and that's the way it should be. Because you get beyond that model, and you get yourself into as my dad likes to say, a mel of a hess. You just do, right? You always, people are going to get upset about money, who's in charge, who got elected, who didn't, all that kind of stuff. And I hate elections in any Christian institution anywhere. Sometimes they're necessary, but they are always a pain in the butt. I have been in churches where they have elected elders, and man, you want to see Satan raise his head up in a church when people start politicking for authority in the church. Oh man, right? It's just ugly. But there is some hope there. The more the liberals die off, I mean, it's going to get to the point where, like, Louisville, there's a Presbyterian seminary in Louisville that has almost no students. I mean, they just have such a large cash fund from people who gave it a lot of money, 50 years ago, that they're able to keep the doors open. But it's going to end up that way at Yale and Princeton and Harvard and all that kind of stuff. They're not going to have any students. And so it's just, it's just dying. It is dying. And quite frankly, let's hurry up, get it buried, and get to the church to have some potato salad, because it needs to go. I mean, you've already seen it. One of the fastest growing, Megan and I were talking about this a few weeks ago, one of the fastest growing phenomenons in inner cities are these craft beer places that used to be churches. Because the churches are mainline liberal churches that got to the point where nobody was there anymore, and they sell the property off, and they're downtown, some hipster buys it and ends up turning into a bar. But it's happening. It is happening. Anyway. Well, folks, that's a 30,000-foot level of where we've gone from the first century church all the way up to where we are, today. I know I can't, get into every single denomination, because as we saw, there's too many of them. There are more than 40,000 denominations out there. I can't cover all of them, but you got your handy dandy little sheet there, and you can always just go Google. Almost every denomination's got a website with the frequently asked question thing where you can go. I made the mistake when I was doing, last free seminar, when I was doing the different religions, why I'm a Christian and not a ... And I went onto the Mormon website to look at their frequently asked question. And they actually, when you go on the Mormon website, a pop-up comes up and goes, someone's waiting to chat with you right now. And you can ask a Mormon missionary questions if you want, but beware, because your cookies and stuff on your computer tracks everything. So now every time I log onto Facebook, a Mormon's waiting to talk to you. There are advertisements over here, and I'm like, I don't want to talk to a Mormon, all right? They don't come to my house anymore,
Christ Community meets on Saturday at 5 p.m. and Sunday at 10:30 a.m. For more information, visit www.christcommunity.net or check out our Facebook page.